November 26, 1943. The Mediterranean Sea, 14 miles off the Algerian coast. HMHS Newfoundland moved through black water under a moonless sky. She was painted white, built to be seen, and marked for protection. Large red crosses on her hull, and superstructure, the kind that were meant to say to any watcher, "This ship carries the wounded." Her decks were quiet, her lights steady. From a distance, she looked almost calm. Inside, the calm was only a routine people practiced. In the wards, about 340 wounded men lay in bunks arranged in tight rows. Some were British and American. Some were prisoners of war, injured like the rest. Bandages and plaster casts turned bodies into shapes that barely looked human. A few men stared at the ceiling without speaking. Others slept in short, drugged fragments. The air carried antiseptic, damp canvas, and the sharp edge of morphine. Orders had been given, charts written, dressings changed. The ship was supposed to be a passage away from the front, a corridor back toward long-term hospitals, and for some, home. At 6:42 p.m., the ship stopped being a hospital and became an emergency. A blast ripped through the engine room with a force that felt like the hull itself had been struck by a hammer. The deck jumped. Bulkheads groaned. The lights flickered and died, leaving wards in sudden darkness broken only by emergency lanterns and small torches snatched from lockers. Men who could not move were thrown sideways in their bunks. Men who could move tried to sit up and failed. Somewhere below, metal twisted and screamed as compartments flooded. The ship shuddered again, not from a second hit, but from the weight of water forcing its way into spaces that were never meant to fill. Sound became the first enemy. There were screams in corridors, not the sharp cries of pain that nurses knew, but the raw terror of men who understood what drowning meant when they could not stand. Someone called for a doctor. Someone prayed. Someone shouted instructions that no one could hear clearly. The smell changed as smoke pushed through ventilation shafts, mixing with disinfectant until the air tasted dirty and hot. Then came the tilt. At first, it was only enough to make loose objects slide. A cup rolled off a tray. A metal instrument clattered away into the dark. Then the list deepened, and the floor stopped feeling like a floor. Walking became a fight to stay upright. Doors that should have swung freely jammed against their frames. In the lower decks, seawater began creeping along passageways, cold and fast, lifting linen and floating small items that made the rising level impossible to ignore. The ship had lifeboats. The nurses had stations. Maritime rules were clear about who should go first, and the ship carried women whose lives were not supposed to be spent in the last minutes of a sinking vessel. But many of the men in those wards could not reach a boat. Some were strapped down after surgery. Some were in full body casts. Some had head wounds that left them confused or unable to follow instructions. A number were simply too weak to stand. They could hear the water. They could feel the ship leaning more with each passing moment. And they could not save themselves. In the first minutes after the explosion, Australian military nurses moved through the darkness between bunks, steadying men, checking airways, cutting straps, making decisions without waiting for permission. They understood the mathematics before anyone said it aloud. There would not be time for everyone. Over the next 20 minutes, they would face a choice that did not belong in any manual. Leave while they still could, or stay with patients who could not move as the ship went down around them. What they chose, in those minutes, would be remembered by survivors for the rest of their lives, and forgotten by most of the world. By late November 1943, the Mediterranean War had entered a new phase, but it was far from safe. Earlier that year, Allied forces had completed the North African campaign. Axis troops had surrendered in Tunisia in May. The sea lanes that once seemed dominated by German and Italian naval power were now heavily patrolled by Allied ships and aircraft. Convoys moved more frequently. Ports in Algeria and Tunisia were busy with transports, supply ships, and hospital vessels. In September 1943, Allied armies had landed in southern Italy. The fighting that followed was slow and costly. German forces withdrew northward in stages, turning mountains and river lines into defensive barriers. Battles such as Salerno and the long push toward Naples filled field hospitals with casualties. Many of the wounded were not dying, but they were broken in ways that required months of treatment. Hospital ships became essential links in this chain. Under the Geneva Convention, hospital ships were protected vessels. They were painted white, marked clearly with red crosses, and illuminated at night so they could not be mistaken for combat ships. They were forbidden to carry weapons, ammunition, or troops fit for duty. Their purpose was limited to the transport and treatment of wounded personnel. In theory, these markings guaranteed safety. In practice, the Mediterranean remained a contested sea. German submarines still operated from bases in southern France and the Adriatic. Aircraft flying from Italian airfields continued to strike shipping when opportunities appeared. Mines were laid in approaches to ports and along expected routes. Even as the Allies advanced on land, the sea retained its own dangers. HMHS Newfoundland was part of this medical network. Originally a passenger liner, she had been converted for hospital service. Her cabins had been replaced with wards. Operating theatres had been installed where dining rooms once stood. She carried trained medical staff, British and Australian nurses, doctors, orderlies, alongside naval crew responsible for navigation and engines. In November 1943, her mission was considered routine. She had embarked wounded men from hospitals in North Africa, many of whom had been evacuated from the Italian front. Some were recovering from surgery. Others were stable but required specialist care available only in Britain. The voyage north across the Mediterranean was expected to be a passage towards safety. For the men aboard, this journey marked a turning point. They had survived shell fire, artillery barrages, and close combat. They had endured field dressing stations, emergency amputations, infections, and transport by truck or train to rear hospitals. Being placed aboard a hospital ship felt like a final step away from danger. The red crosses on the hull were not just paint. They were a symbol of protection recognized by both sides. Yet the Mediterranean in 1943 was layered with hazards that could not always distinguish between combatant and caregiver. Mines drifted or lay anchored beneath the surface, invisible and silent. A ship did not need to be targeted deliberately to be destroyed. A misjudged route, a newly laid field, or a shift in current could bring catastrophe without warning. Naval records from the period show that hospital ships, though generally respected, were not immune to accidents or, in some cases, attack. What was at stake on Newfoundland that evening was not only the survival of 340 wounded men. It was the credibility of a system built on mutual restraint. If a marked hospital ship could be lost within sight of the North African coast, then the promise of safe passage for the wounded was fragile. The men lying in those wards had already paid a heavy price in the Italian campaign. Many faced permanent disability. Some would never return to active service. Their evacuation represented a commitment by Allied command that the injured would be cared for, transported, and protected. When the explosion tore into the ship's engine room, it threatened more than a single vessel. It exposed how thin the line of safety could be, even for those who no longer carried rifles. Among the medical staff aboard HMHS Newfoundland were 6 members of the Australian Army Nursing Service. They were not passengers. They were commissioned military nurses, trained, uniformed, and accustomed to working under conditions most civilians never experienced. Though British nurses formed the majority of the ship's nursing complement, the Australians served beside them as equals, assigned to wards without distinction of nationality. They were in their mid-20s to early 30s. All volunteers. All had already spent years in uniform. The Australian Army Nursing Service had expanded rapidly after 1939. Many of its members had begun their careers in civilian hospitals across Sydney, Melbourne, Brisbane, and smaller regional towns. When war came, they applied for overseas service, knowing it meant separation from family and exposure to danger. By 1943, most had served in multiple theatres. Several had worked in the Middle East during the North African campaign. They had treated burns from tank battles, shrapnel wounds from artillery strikes, and infections that followed desert fighting. Some had endured air raids in Cairo or Alexandria, learning to continue procedures while bombs fell nearby. The work required steadiness more than speed, monitoring pulse rates, changing dressings, administering morphine in careful doses. On Newfoundland, their tasks were routine but demanding. Night shifts in surgical wards required constant observation of men recovering from operations. Orthopedic wards held patients in traction, their limbs suspended by metal frames and weights. Head injury cases required quiet supervision and frequent neurological checks. The nurses moved between bunks with charts in hand, recording temperatures and noting small changes that could signal improvement or decline. Among them was Sister Ellen Savage, 28 years old, from Sydney. Colleagues described her as methodical and calm. She did not raise her voice. During earlier air alerts in North Africa, she had continued her rounds without visible alarm. She preferred the surgical wards, where attention to detail mattered most. Men under her care often remembered her for her steady manner rather than dramatic gestures. Matron Olive Pashka, 34, from Melbourne, was senior among the Australian group. She carried herself with authority, shaped by experience. She had been present during previous evacuations in 1941 and understood what maritime emergencies could look like. Her responsibilities extended beyond direct patient care. She oversaw discipline, coordination, and the practical needs of the nurses assigned to her section. Sister Margaret Anderson, 26, came from rural Queensland. She was younger than Pashka, but had already seen active service in forward hospitals. Fellow nurses later recalled that she spoke softly to patients who were close to death, staying at bedsides long after formal duties were complete. Her strength was not physical stature, but persistence. None of these women considered themselves exceptional. They had chosen military nursing because it aligned with their profession. The oath they had taken to care for the sick and wounded did not contain clauses about convenience or safety. In war, that oath was tested regularly. They had already worked in environments where artillery could land nearby and evacuation orders might arrive suddenly. Assignment to a hospital ship was viewed as necessary service rather than privilege. While protected under international law, such ships still crossed contested waters. Mines and submarines did not always discriminate. The nurses understood this, but it did not dominate their thinking. Their focus remained on the men in their wards. What set them apart was not bravado or rhetoric. It was a shared understanding that a patient was not abandoned. Military discipline reinforced that principle. So did professional training. When a man was placed in their care, responsibility did not depend on nationality, rank, or likelihood of survival. He was a patient first. On the evening of November 26, 1943, that principle would be tested under conditions no training manual fully addressed. In less than half an hour, each of these women would have to decide how far duty extended when the ship beneath them was sinking. The explosion had struck deep in the engine room, below the waterline. Whether caused by a mine or torpedo was not immediately clear to those on board. What mattered was the damage. A section of hull had been torn open. Steam lines ruptured. Electrical systems failed almost at once. 6 crewmen in the engineering spaces were killed instantly. Others staggered out burned or stunned, reporting flooding that could not be contained. Within minutes, the ship's officers understood the severity. Pumps were engaged, but water entered faster than it could be expelled. Compartments designed to be watertight were compromised. The vessel began to settle by the stern and lean to starboard. The list increased steadily. The numbers were unforgiving. Approximately 340 wounded men were aboard. Some could walk with assistance, many could not. Dozens were in traction frames bolted to the deck. Several were recovering from recent surgery, their abdomens or chests stitched and bandaged. Others had head injuries that left them disoriented. At least 60 were entirely immobilized, strapped, splintered, or too weak to move without help. Lifeboats lined the upper deck, but lowering them required coordination and time. A stretcher could not easily pass through narrow doorways, especially as the tilt increased. Corridors that had been level became sloping ramps. Trolleys rolled uncontrolled. Metal lockers slid across floors and struck walls with force. Two main stairwells were partially blocked by debris from the blast. Emergency lighting cast weak, uneven shadows. Smoke drifted from below, mixing with steam and the smell of seawater. In the lowest wards, water seeped along the deck, then rose visibly around bed legs. Maritime protocol offered clarity in theory. Women and medical staff were to evacuate early, assisting ambulatory patients to boats. Nurses had assigned stations. If they moved immediately, they could likely reach lifeboats within minutes. But that path assumed patients could follow. Men strapped in traction could not simply stand. Patients in full body casts required 4 to 6 people to lift safely. Those who had lost limbs often lacked the strength to balance on a sharply tilted deck. Even some who could walk became confused in darkness and noise. Estimates from the bridge suggested the ship might remain afloat for 20 to 25 minutes. No one could guarantee that figure. As flooding spread, that margin shrank. The calculation became stark. If the nurses left at once, many of the most seriously wounded would remain below. They would face rising water alone, unable to free themselves. Even among those who could move, panic threatened to undo order. Without guidance, men might crowd stairwells, fall, or become trapped. There was no directive requiring the nurses to stay beyond reasonable effort. Several officers, recognizing the danger, urged them to proceed toward lifeboats while evacuation was still possible. It was not cowardice. It was recognition that another explosion or sudden roll could take everyone with it. Yet in the wards, the choice felt less abstract. Patients called out by name to nurses who had tended them for days. Some asked directly if they would be left behind. Others said nothing, watching as water crept closer. For the nurses, the dilemma was immediate and personal. Every additional trip below deck reduced their own chance of survival. Every minute spent freeing one man was a minute not spent reaching safety. There was no solution that preserved all lives. The ship continued to list. The water continued to rise. Decisions had to be made in seconds, without certainty and without reassurance that effort would be enough. In the first moments after the blast, movement replaced shock. Sister Ellen Savage had been on duty in a surgical ward when the explosion threw her against a bulkhead. She regained balance quickly. Around her, men were shouting in confusion. One patient had been knocked partially from his bunk, his intravenous line torn loose. Savage secured him first. Then she moved from bed to bed, checking airways, cutting loose straps, speaking in short, steady phrases. "Stay still. We are getting you up." The lighting was poor. Emergency lamps cast narrow circles that made the ward appear smaller and more crowded than before. The tilt forced nurses to brace themselves with one hand against walls as they worked. Communication systems had failed. Orders from the bridge did not reach every deck. Matron Olive Pashka, positioned higher in the ship, recognized that waiting for formal coordination would waste time. She moved toward the lower wards rather than the lifeboat stations. Along the way, she passed crewmen preparing davits and calling for stretcher parties. In a smoke-filled stairwell, Australian and British nurses met briefly. The conversation was practical and brief. Ambulatory patients would be directed upward first. Stretcher cases would follow in order of severity and accessibility. No one spoke of leaving before the wards were cleared. In Sister Margaret Anderson's section, 22 men required attention. 8 could move with support. 14 could not. Stretchers proved difficult to maneuver through doorways now angled sharply. Anderson and 2 others abandoned the idea of formal lifting procedures. They slid mattresses onto the floor and dragged patients upward, inch by inch, pausing when hands slipped on damp surfaces. By 6:50 p.m., water had reached the lowest bunks on one deck. Men awoke to cold seeping through blankets. Nurses waded through rising water to cut restraints from post-operative patients. One orderly slipped and fell, submerging briefly before being pulled upright by a wounded man using his remaining strength. The first lifeboat was lowered while these efforts continued. It carried walking wounded and 2 nurses assigned to that station. Lowering was uneven because of the ship's list. The boat struck the water hard, but remained upright. From the deck above, more patients were brought forward. Time compressed. At approximately 10 minutes after the explosion, the list had increased markedly. Moving uphill along a corridor required physical effort. Stretcher teams struggled to maintain footing. In one passage, a patient slid free of a grasp and struck a doorframe, sustaining additional injury. He was lifted again without discussion. In the orthopedic ward, Pashka faced men secured in traction frames bolted to the deck. Removing pins or dismantling equipment would consume precious minutes. She directed orderlies to unbolt entire beds instead. Bandages and rope were used to secure frames for transport toward the stairwell. Meanwhile, Savage continued repeated trips between her ward and the evacuation point. Some men resisted leaving if they believed others were worse off. One patient, aware of the water rising below, urged her to help someone else. She did not argue. She returned for him later. By the 15-minute mark, officers were warning that the vessel might not remain stable much longer. Additional lifeboats were prepared. Noise increased, metal shifting, water surging, shouted instructions overlapping. In one compartment, several wounded prisoners of war awaited assistance. Despite pressure to prioritize by nationality, they were treated in the same sequence as others. There was no time for debate. As the angle steepened, corridors became hazardous inclines. Nurses and crew formed improvised chains, passing patients upward hand to hand. Every successful transfer created space for another attempt. No one paused to assess how many remained below. There was only the next man to move and the next ascent to make, while the ship continued to sink beneath them. By shortly after 7 p.m., the ship's condition had moved beyond control. The list passed a point where ordinary movement was no longer possible. Decks that had served as passageways became steep slopes. Stairwells felt vertical. Equipment broke loose and slid with force, striking bulkheads or vanishing into darkened spaces below. The sound of water was no longer distant. It rushed through compartments, filling them with steady pressure. In one lower corridor, Ellen Savage continued forward despite the water reaching her shoulders. She moved by touch along the wall, calling out to a patient who had answered moments earlier. The lighting had failed completely in that section. She located the man by voice and secured her arm around him. He could not stand without support. Together, they struggled toward what she believed was the stairwell. Behind them, a surge of water knocked loose floating debris. The ship shuddered again as internal structures gave way. The angle increased sharply. Furniture and unsecured equipment slid past, colliding with bodies and walls. Savage forced herself upward, pausing only to catch breath before pushing on. Elsewhere, Margaret Anderson and several crew members were attempting to clear a ward whose door had jammed under pressure from the list. Voices inside indicated at least 3 patients remained trapped. An axe was brought forward. Striking the warped frame required repeated blows. Water pooled around their legs as they worked. When the door finally gave way, the men inside were dragged free across splintered wood and carried toward higher decks. On the upper levels, Matron Pashka coordinated the final loading of lifeboats. There was little order left beyond immediate necessity. Patients were passed forward rapidly, lifted, or in some cases lowered directly into boats by rope. A final craft was crowded well beyond intended capacity. Officers shouted warnings about weight and balance. There was no alternative. At approximately 7:14 p.m., the ship's movement changed from sinking to rolling. The stern dipped, then the vessel swung heavily to starboard. Those on deck felt the sudden shift as footing disappeared. The hull rotated, exposing the red crosses along her side at an angle no one had imagined. People were thrown clear into the sea. Others clung to railings until their grip failed. The roll was decisive. The Newfoundland capsized. For a brief moment, she lay on her side, a white surface against dark water. Then she began to slip beneath the surface. Air escaped from interior compartments in violent bursts. Debris spread outward. Lifeboats, already in the water, struggled to maneuver clear of suction and floating wreckage. In the sea, survivors fought to remain above water. Some were injured anew in the fall. Oil from ruptured tanks spread across the surface. The night concealed distance and direction. The Australian nurses were among those in the water. They did not attempt to swim away from clusters of wounded men. Instead, they moved toward voices calling for help. Savage supported a soldier who could not tread water. Anderson secured hold of another whose strength was failing. Paschke assisted where she could, guiding men toward nearby boats. The ship disappeared completely within minutes. Silence followed, broken only by shouts and the sound of waves against overturned debris. In darkness, lifeboats gathered survivors as best they could. Some men were missing, lost below when compartments flooded too quickly for rescue. The crisis that had begun 20 minutes earlier had ended in cold water under an unlit sky. What remained were those who had been brought clear, and those who had not. Rescue did not come instantly, but it came quickly enough to matter. Allied destroyers operating in the area received distress signals and altered course. Searchlights cut across the dark surface of the Mediterranean, illuminating lifeboats, floating wreckage, and men clinging to debris. Survivors were hauled aboard with ropes and scrambling nets. Many were shivering uncontrollably. Some were unconscious from shock or exhaustion. The final count was taken over the following hours. Of the approximately 340 patients aboard, the majority were recovered alive. 53 did not survive. Some killed in the initial explosion, others lost in flooding below decks or during the capsize. Among the crew, more than 20 were dead, including those in the engine room at the moment of impact. 2 British nurses were later reported missing and presumed drowned at their stations. All 6 Australian nurses survived. They did not regard survival as an achievement. Once aboard the rescue vessels, they resumed work. Blankets were distributed. Wet clothing was removed. Hypothermia was treated with what limited supplies were available. Some of the nurses required medical attention themselves, bruises, cuts, exhaustion, but they declined sedation or rest until patients had been stabilized. A formal naval inquiry followed in the days ahead. Investigators examined damage reports and survivor testimony. The conclusion indicated that the ship had likely struck a mine rather than being deliberately torpedoed. Minefields had been laid in the region by German forces, and navigation in wartime waters carried inherent risk. The presence of Red Cross markings did not protect against a drifting explosive device. Officially, the loss was recorded as an accident of war. The conduct of the medical staff was also documented. Reports described nurses continuing evacuation efforts under extreme conditions. Statements from rescued patients emphasized that assistance had been provided to the last possible moment. Some survivors noted that nurses returned below decks more than once. These accounts were included in dispatches but summarized in restrained language. In subsequent weeks, decorations were announced. Matron Olive Paschke received the Royal Red Cross First Class. Sisters Ellen Savage and Margaret Anderson were awarded the Royal Red Cross Second Class. Other members of the medical staff were similarly recognized. The citations were brief, referring to gallantry and devotion to duty. The nurses themselves did not seek publicity. When asked about their actions, they described them as part of professional responsibility. They avoided dramatic phrasing. In private correspondence, several emphasized the teamwork of British and Australian staff rather than individual acts. Service continued. The surviving Australian nurses returned to duty within a short period. They were reassigned to hospitals supporting ongoing operations in Italy and elsewhere. War did not pause for reflection. Casualties continued to arrive from the front, and trained nurses remained in demand. The sinking of Newfoundland, contributed to ongoing discussions within naval and medical circles about evacuation procedures and the vulnerability of hospital ships. While international law already provided protection, the incident underscored that hazards at sea could not always be prevented. Training manuals in later years included references to maritime evacuation under combat conditions, informed in part by experiences such as this. For the families of the 53 patients who did not survive, official letters conveyed regret and basic facts. In some cases, survivors later wrote privately to relatives, explaining that the wounded had not been abandoned. These letters, preserved in personal archives, became part of the human record of the event. Over time, the story receded from public attention. There were no major monuments marking the site. The wreck remained on the seabed, its white paint long since faded. Within military nursing circles, however, the example endured. It was cited in lectures not as legend, but as a case study in decision-making under pressure. The broader war continued toward its conclusion in 1945. The Italian campaign dragged on through harsh winters and slow advances. Many of the men rescued from Newfoundland eventually returned home. Some carried permanent injuries. Some resumed civilian lives and raised families. The event did not alter the course of the war in strategic terms. It did not change front lines or surrender dates. Its impact was quieter. It demonstrated that the obligations of medical service persisted even when protection failed. It showed that adherence to duty could exist alongside uncertainty and fear. Today, the sinking of HMHS Newfoundland remains a measured reminder. In 20 minutes of crisis, choices were made without expectation of recognition. Those choices did not save everyone. They did save many. The Mediterranean returned to calm after that night. But the record of what occurred on November 26, 1943, endures in archives and in the lives that continued, because nurses did not turn away.